Hello. Today I'm going to talk about post-traumatic stress syndrome from a military creation. People in the military that go through combat, war, come back with so much with this stress. I like the word stress. I've been studying the word stress for over 50 years. So understanding the word stress is part of it. What I have is 5 approaches to understanding and doing something about it. There. Each approach, I put it in a Gestalt form of psychology. Now, what does the word Gestalt means? It's a German word, means the whole. You have to look at the whole. I take a math point of view in the sense the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. When you talk about post-traumatic stress syndrome, you have to look at it as a whole aspect. What created it? What do you do about it? So understanding each one of those words, post-traumatic stress syndrome, what each one of those words, then put it together and see what has, how, if you want to say psychology, define your situation from being in a combat. Now I'm going to go a little bit more because I have 5 points. The last point I'm going to go into is, what do you do about it? How do you never come back from it. Forget about the word come back or bring you back, recover from. You never recover from it. But what you do is reform yourself. You have to reform yourself unless you want to endure the past. By definition, the word post means past. Something was created in the past and it's haunting you, or do you regret, or basically it's fear. Let me deal with the word. The fundamental word I base everything on is the word fear. Now, really understanding words in what I'm saying is a must. If you want to change, if you don't want to live in the past, which is and what you've done or what you can't do and what. But the key characteristics from my way I see things, you don't live with it. You reform from it. You don't recover from war. You reform yourself from war. One of the best examples is the Shillong Temple. Your Kung Fu temple. How did that even come about? In Buddhism, it deals with fear. Fear is one of the essence of doing Buddhism that you neutralize. The best word I could see it, you neutralize from your past involved. If your past haunts you, most likely it's from fear, created fear. And how do you get over it? Now within fear, there's another great word that we have to deal with in life. If you come in from combat, guilt. And there's so many other emotional words that we have to deal with in order to resolve or to change or view it differently. It is a very powerful post-traumatic stress syndrome, anchors you into the past. And coming out of that to reform yourself takes some real understanding and decision making. Now, I said there's 5 approaches. You have first 4 are understanding each one of those words, post-traumatic stress and syndrome. And only by understanding each one of those words, you can see the Gestalt aspects of you at this moment in time, after you survived. The people that don't have post-traumatic from being in combat are really dealing with the people that are dead. That's it. So if you're alive, that's opportunity. But you have to take it in deciding. And I'm going to go through each characteristics within those 4 words. And then the 5th word, it begins with a definition. See, psychology is they can tell you about the past. They have great definitions about situations of impulses and stuff like that and all that. But to say they don't, their judgment is lacking in the sense that they're secular. They cannot define what is a human. Ask them what is a human. Then what is the goal of being a human? That's the characteristics that they don't deal with because they're secular. That limits themselves to, if you want to say, matter things are involved. So what I'm going to tell, the fifth thing is I'm defining yourself as a spiritual being. Understanding that each one of those words, understanding the word spirit from a dictionary point of view. Then from that point of view, you go into what does it mean? And this is why we transcend, if you want to say, our reality. Humans create their emotional, physical, mental reality. Animals live in their brain, so that's who they are. We have two different aspects of why we're spiritual beings. And I'll go into that because that's part of reforming yourself. That is the power of reforming yourself. Understanding that you are a spiritual being is the power, the force, the impetus to reform yourself to something greater, something so much better than you ever thought possible. Using your past to really understand life and people and appreciate life. If you're in that post, you can't appreciate life. You're stuck. It's repetitive, dreams, sleep, anger, whole bunch of characteristics. You can go type in Google post-traumatic syndrome, stress syndrome, and see all the characteristics that you have. So really understanding each one of those words, I'm going to get you as far as a Gestalt point of view, and I'm going to repeat this over. The whole is greater than the sum of its parts. So the more you understand, the more but you have to have that last element that I'm going to talk about. Defining yourself as a spiritual being, creating your emotional, physical reality, to not reform, but to basically build, to reform conform. Oh, sometimes being old, it really hurts. I'm an old man, so bear with me on that. You have to really think of not recovering, but reforming yourself to a new reality that is far, far more interesting, pushed off by that stress in the military. So these are understanding each one of the words, and this is a series, so you can go in each part because I got to break it down and put context with the fifth element of this whole program I have brought about to deal with war and combat. I don't care if you're the enemy, I don't care if you're on the good side, bad side, the human condition in the male in war. And you get this after you survive. Now, I talked about the Shaolin Temple, the Kung Fu Temple you hear about and everything. How did it even come about? And it's basically a bunch of warriors. Can you imagine it being a Chinese army and you survive all those hand-to-hand combats through your combat skills? The swords, all the weapons, because Kung Fu is very noted for weapons and weapon ability. And here you are, and you're stressed out. You survived. All your buddies that you've known have passed on. They got killed in the war, and you survived all this battle. And they're stressed out. And Buddhism deals with fear. That word fear is a consequential word. We use fear for many things, good and bad. A fear of not achieving something to physical fear that someone's going to hurt me. This is going to happen. I'm not going to make it. So fear is something we have to address. And I'm going to deal with that with another word, love. Now, they're like two opposite ends. You have fear and you have love. And the spectrum between those two is makes the Grand Canyon. It's like night and day. And in fact, it is. It's night and day. They're opposites involved. So really grasping what you are and what you can do to reform yourself to something greater than you are at the moment in this condition is the goal of this video series. To appreciate your human condition, your service or your survival, any way you look at it. But the consequences of the human conditions you were in, you saw death, you saw friends die involved. I've studied it, the word stress, for 50 years, what it is. And psychology only goes so far because they can't identify with you. I'm going to identify everything. Let's begin. The first thing is this. Where do you keep your emotions? Where do your emotions that you've had form? It's in the body. And what does the mind do? It is the mind holds ideas through words and definitions and recognizes experiences. But the body holds the emotions. That's why when you have a traumatic experience and you have a stress condition, you shake or anything, because it's an emotional thing. Now, what holds your emotions? You've got to understand, you've got to have a vocabulary on this one to really see what you have to do and the ways you have to do stuff. And it's the fascia. The word fascia, myofascial release. Now, you look up John Barnes, myofascial release, you begin to understand that condition. And that's part of being human. Myo means muscle, fascia, because when you shake and your muscles do this and that, it's the fascia jerking the muscles. Fascia determines range of motion, and muscle determines your strength. That's how it works. It's a relationship. Fascia, since the emotional, shapes your body. In other words, we have the word body language. And understanding body language, you're communicating. And it's an emotional projection. So really understanding fascia, myofascia, and the release of fascia, it can be the release of emotions. So you don't have that impulse, that physical impulse. I'm going to address alcohol. What does it do? How does it work? Now let's go back to the Shaolin Temple and all these soldiers. And Buddhism was introduced into China. And how do they deal with their stress involved? They didn't abandon their martial arts skills, they call martial arts skills, their war skills that survived them so much. They started using them as an exercise to reform themselves, not to have guilt, not to have that trauma, to be soft, to be. Now, the shortcomings of Buddhism involve there is no God. You realize the force, you realize because of the Taoist point of view, is part of Buddhism in China. You have to understand the Taoist point of naturalness. There's order in the universe. And what you're reforming yourself to is order of the universe. There's definitely order. You may not see it or recognize or identify it, but the universe is order. There's a natural way, a flow, like a river going down, a stream going down. It hits a rock. The water goes around it or goes over it, but it doesn't stop there. So really understanding the idea of flow, of what's natural, what is part of the natural laws. I love physics, and quantum physics, regular physics involved because it's order. Math defines order. In mathematics, we can depend on because it describes the order of the universe, of our natural surroundings, what we deal with. That's the good news. And when you're out of sync with that order, that's when you have conflict of interest involved. And this is where you're stuck in post-traumatic stress syndrome. Post means past. You can't get past your past. Why? Why can't you get past it? Is the question there. And the simple reason, you're human. And you have memory. And events leave an impression on you. How you define those events, how you deal with it, how you recognize it. And when you're in war, so war is around you, or you're actually in the combat situation, you have fear. That's just the nature of the condition, because you're placing yourself in a violent situation that you recognize. And how well do you accept it, or how well you deal with it? Each one's different. And I'll go into that too. But this whole series dealing with post-traumatic syndromes has been coming along for me for a long time. I've done a lot of research. I've interviewed a lot of people on this area and how they dealt with it, involved in combat, in reform, and how they reformed themselves afterwards to deal with the chaos or the bleakness. There is no love in combat. It's hell in its own way, because you're always under the threat of death. Now, I'm also going to go into alcohol. Why do soldiers drink so much? And the effects of that drinking. That's another, how can I say, condition that hurts you, that limits you. Alcohol always limits you. I'll go into that as well. So this is a series of how you, step by step, taking each one of those words, and like I said, there's 5. There's post-traumatic, there's stress, and there's what's called the syndrome. And the 5th one is the definition of your spiritual being, defining you as a spiritual being, which allows you to reform yourself. And I'll give you techniques, methods to make you realize an understanding of what you have to do in this, if you want to reform yourself in a dynamic way. You can do a little bit, you can do a whole lot. There's many ways to reform yourself where you don't suffer. That word suffer from the past. That word suffer is a key concept. If you want to suffer in your life, the rest of your life, that's your choice. But the whole program of this program is to give you choices and help you realize what is order and what is disorder. What can life be and what life is if you don't realize order involved. And how do you reform yourself? All these old Chinese soldiers that joined the Shaolin Temple reformed themselves as a group. They actually helped other people. They dealt with the stress. Their wars. When you do hand-to-hand combat with swords and bloods all over you, and the smell and the decay, the aftermath of that, the horrendous effect, because we're not that way normally. That's the point. It is unnatural, but it is a condition of evil. And that is what we have to deal with. If you can't really define evil. Now, I'm going to start off with a concept. And that is that humans are spiritual beings. There is a God. And he infused us, think of that word, infused us with 4 virtues. And with that is what we use to judge in everything. First virtue is prudence. You have to understand that word from several points of view. Understand the word prudence. It's not talked about in this social disorder. They don't want to talk about prudence. Justice. That's the other word you really have to. We do that naturally. We look for justice. We look for order. That's why we do math. That's why we do a lot of things, to see order in some way or another involved. Now, here we go, memory. Being old to have it. I had it down, involved. There's also temperance. Temperance is dealing with yourself. Temperance of what you put out there. Temperance is don't you hurt your body, involved. That is something that's part infused in you, and this virtue.